Can you introduce yourself and tell us who
Okay,
you are?
first, I am, my name is Lloyd Ultan. I'm the Bronx Borough Historian Emeritus and also a professor of history at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey.
And how did you come to be the Bronx historian? And can you discuss that role?
According to New York State law, the education law, every county in the state is supposed to have an historian appointed by the local appointing authority. In the 5 counties of the city of New York that are also the boroughs of the city of New York, we are officially called borough historians, and we are appointed by our respective borough presidents. And we serve at that borough president's pleasure. In short, I could be fired at any time, which I was. There are certain duties that we have to perform by that law. For instance, we're supposed to encourage the preservation of all records. If any records wanders off, we are supposed to track it down and bring it back. We're to encourage private people, businessmen and others, to preserve their records. And then we're supposed to use the records in order to write the history of the area. Those are required. Now, there has been stuff accreted to it over the years. One of the things is we give lectures, we give tours, we answer questions that are posed to us by public officials and also by ordinary people. I have appeared in documentaries and also on talk shows, and so that was all part of the business of being a borough historian. Somebody bumped into a car.
It's okay. Okay.
All right.
All right. And how did you first get tapped to be this role?
Well, the usual way things work with the Bronx Borough Historian is that a person enters the office vertically and leaves it horizontally. And after my predecessor was on his deathbed, I received a call from the borough president's office. The borough president at the time was Fernando Ferrer, and I got they asked me, "Do you want to be the borough historian?" And I said, well, let me think about it. Yes. That was in 1996. And I have served as the borough historian until 2023. My successor happens to be a fellow by the name of Angel Hernandez, who is a former student of mine. So I am supposed to mentor him as he is getting to know the ropes, and that's what I'm doing too. And I'm still doing the same stuff that I've always done.
Do you recall when you first became aware of the Poe Cottage and Poe Park?
I was a kid. I grew up in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx, grew up in the Bronx, and so Fordham Road, which is just about a block away from the southern end of what is today Poe Park, was a major shopping area. And whenever my mother went shopping, the department stores that were then in the area, we'd come up here. And at one point she pointed out to me that this is where Edgar Allan Poe lived, and this is called Poe Park, and that's Poe Cottage.
And as a kid, did you know who Edgar Allan Poe was, and did you learn about him?
I got to know. Obviously, he was a giant in American literature, and even in classes, we read some of his works, his short stories, and some of his poems. So I was well aware of who Edgar Allan Poe was.
And what was here prior to the park, and can you tell me how the cottage came to exist here?
Well, the cottage originally existed across Kingsbridge Road from the southern end of the park. The cottage was one of several cottages of the same type that were built by the Valentine family in the second decade of the 19th century, and they were meant to house part-time farmhands to when they wanted to bring in the crop. And in 1846, Edgar Allan Poe came up here from his abode in New York City in order to live here because his wife was dying of tuberculosis. And this was the last throw of the dice. He knew that the air in the village of Fordham was clean and clear, and he hoped that would cure her of tuberculosis. Unfortunately, it did not. In January of 1847, she passed away in the cottage. And he lived there with his mother-in-law, who was also his aunt, because he married his cousin. For the next few years, he wrote in the cottage several poems, Ulalume, The Bells, and Annabel Lee. He also wrote the short story, The Cask of Amontillado, while living in the cottage. Those are fairly well known. He also wrote other stories as well that is not as well known. But so he was rather productive here. The problem is that Edgar Allan Poe was very poor, and he was never paid enough for the works that he published. They were published in newspapers, and he refused. He was not independently wealthy as other authors at the time were, nor did he hold another job. He felt that he ought to be paid adequately for his literary product. And of course, in the time that he lived, that didn't work because he was constantly poor. Consequently, Poe Cottage is a very unusual historic house because it is the house of a poor person. You go around the country and you go and visit historic houses, they're usually the houses of the wealthy and the powerful. Here is, you can see what a poor person lived like, and if you see a house that was a house of a wealthy person around the 1840s, and go to Poe Cottage, and you find a house of a poor person, you could see the difference in the way people lived at the time. Poe lived here, and in 1849, there was the opportunity for him to become the editor of a brand new literary magazine, and he went on a lecture tour in order to raise money to start the magazine. And he was down in Virginia on a lecture tour, and he was on his way back here when he stopped off in Baltimore for the night, and he was discovered outside a polling place. There was an election going on at the time, in the gutter, and completely out of it, muttering all sorts of things that people couldn't understand. He was taken to a hospital, and he died there. And he is buried in Baltimore. And his aunt and mother-in-law, same person, had to tidy up the place, put his affairs in order, and she locked the door and left. And other people had rented the cottage over the years until in the 20th century, the early 20th century, the area became urbanized. And when the area became urbanized, the cottage itself was in jeopardy. The Kingsbridge Road was widened, and Poe Cottage was in the path of the widening. And so a group of citizens got together and had the cottage moved further inward so that the widening of Kingsbridge Road would not interfere with the cottage itself. Then what happened is that the as the area urbanized, directly across the street from what is today Pope Park, there are buildings that were built, four-story buildings, that were built just after the start of the 20th century. And as they were being built, construction debris often fell down onto the roof of Polk Cottage where it was. And immediately an organization began, the American Shakespeare Society of all things, spearheaded the movement to move the cottage to what was then an apple orchard across the street and have it declared a park. And they moved it to the northern part of that park, which they renamed Pope Park. And the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage has been there ever since, and opened as a public museum. In 1975, the Bronx County Historical Society was given the opportunity to tend to the cottage, and it has been run by the Bronx County Historical Society ever since.
You know, you said like when Poe moved up here, it was rural. And
Yeah.
can you discuss what the village of Fordham was like at that time, and
Yeah.
and how the village of Fordham and other villages in the Bronx came to exist?
Well,
We can start at the beginning and then
okay,
work
sure.
our way back.
What is now the Bronx was originally part of Westchester County, New York, and it was largely originally largely agricultural. There were a lot of cattle and sheep that were grazing, and there were also crops that were raised. There were orchards of fruit orchards, peaches and apples and whatever, and raising of wheat and other crops. In 1825, with the opening of the Erie Canal that tapped what is today the Midwest and the wheat crops in the Midwest, that overwhelmed the people who were growing wheat here, so they turned to truck farming. That is, they raised fruits and vegetables and calves for the New York market. So because New York City was growing at the tip of Manhattan Island, it was expanding northward. And as New York City was expanding northward, there were people who wanted to get away from the noise, the racket, the pollution, and the smells of New York, if not all the time, at least for the summer. And they started moving across the Harlem River to the mainland. Many of them were wealthy, and they established mansions where they lived. But also, by the time you hit the 1830s and 1840s, the guys who had owned large swaths of land thought that they could make money by simply cutting off parts of their land and selling that land in house lots for people who wanted to live in a suburban area. And so there, especially in the southern part of the Bronx, in the beginning, there were a lot of suburban villages that began. And when the railroad first came in, the New York and Harlem River Railroad, which is today the Harlem division of Metro North, the commuter railroad, the very first, in 1841, the first station that they established was a station that they called Fordham, because the huge estate that occupied this area was originally called Fordham. So they named it after the old colonial name, Fordham. And that became the nucleus of the village. In the history of railroading in the United States, it's different from the history of railroading in Europe. In railroads in Europe, you went from, railroads were built to go from one place to another place. In the United States, they built railroads to go from some place to no place, because there was the frontier, there was nothing there. And after a certain length of time or period or length of land, they figured, well, this is long enough wait, we can build a railroad station here. And there was nothing around. And when the railroad station was built, there were, you know, a hotel, a general store, you know, something like that would be placed there, and that would be the nucleus of the village, and that's what happened with Fordham. And with Fordham in 1841, the same year that the railroad was built on the mainland, and came to Fordham, the New York Archdiocese purchased a farm just north of the station, or what would be the station, and they started a college, which was originally called St. John's College, which in the early 20th century became Fordham University, and that of course became a destination as well. As people started moving in the 1840s, and they moved in fairly rapidly, the hill to the west of the station began to be occupied by houses in the area, and people started taking the old houses that were built to, the cottages that were built to house part-time farmhands, and they began to rent it for the you know, for the entire year or beyond that, and so a little village grew up, and that included these farms. And by the 1860s, because of the presence of Edgar Allan Poe, and people knew it there, it attracted a number of literary people. There was a person who wrote light comical stories under the pseudonym of Barry Gray. And he lived here, and there was also an Irish poet who moved into this area as well, and they lived in these little houses, and they continued that continued to exist until, of course, urbanization hit, and starting in the early 20th century, and one by one those old houses, those old cottages, began to be torn down and replaced with apartment houses, and the last one to exist is what is now Poe Cottage, because Edgar Allan Poe had lived there.
And like, I know, like the Valentine Burying House, when Valentine built that, was partially built by slaves. Is the same thing? That's what Roger told me.
Well, Valentine had slaves. I'm not sure that he used them to build it.
Okay. Do you think that they had any chance of building slavery? Had any part in building the cottage?
Let me see. In that time, probably not.
Okay.
While slavery was still legal in New York State until 1827, when the cottages were built, which was roughly a decade earlier, most of the slaves were already freed. Okay. And there were very, very few people that had them, and by that time, most of them were basically used as household servants.
John Allan, Poe's adopted father, he had slaves.
Well,
he was a slave owner.
Yeah, but he lived in Virginia.
Yeah.
There's a difference.
Do you think that Poe's life was like here when he lived here? Besides the fact his wife was sick.
We do have some evidence of it, because there were people who came up by railroad to visit Poe, and of course they were his literary friends, and they wrote something about how he lived here. When his wife was still ailing, and obviously before she died, she was lying in bed, covered with all sorts of coverings, and a cat to keep her warm was in there. When he lived here, there was outside a bird cage with a bird inside there, and there were no flowers in front of the cottage. It was all grass. One group went to the nearby woods, and they played a game of leaping. That's what they called it. And, obviously it was something like how far can you leap? And at one point in the game, Edgar Allan Poe had broken his shoe, and the leather had torn. And he came home sheepishly to talk to his mother-in-law, and she said to him, "Oh, Eddie." And basically they had to get it repaired, but it was touch and go, trying to find the money to do this stuff because he was so ill paid. He rented the cottage from the member of the Valentine family that owned the land, but he was a fan of Poe's work anyway, so he rented it to him for let's see, the rent was $100 a year. So it was, and he would never really bother him, to pay the rent on time, because he knew the condition that he was living in. And actually, Mr. Valentine gave Poe a set of dishes, which is still, some of which is still on display in the cottage.
Yeah, and maybe you talked about it a little bit already, but how has the neighborhood changed since Poe's time and since the house moved to this location? Like, well, it's still, the park is still here, the house is still here, but the neighborhood around it has changed.
Oh yes, well, the neighborhood, of course, is now part of a thriving urban area. Not too far away is a major shopping center, Fordham Road, and the people who originally lived in this area when it became urbanized, most of them were Irish, but not all. There were some Germans and Italians. By the time you get to about the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the area became very heavily Jewish. But again, the people, some of the people from the earlier people still were around. There were still Irish and Italians and Germans who were still here as well. When you get to the area around the 1960s, larger numbers of blacks and Puerto Ricans started coming in. And so you have a lot of people who were of Latino origin, because other Latinos came in after the Puerto Ricans. And so you have a lot of people here who are of Latino origin. And the park itself is an amenity for the people in the area throughout the 20th century, as long as it existed. In the 1930s and 40s, there were bands who were contracted to play in the bandstand behind me, and in the summertime, on Wednesday nights, people would come out, especially young teenagers. The girls would be dressed, in their dresses and wearing their white gloves, and the boys would be dressed with their jackets and ties, and they would dance to the music that was here. At one time in the 1940s, the band that was contracted to play here contracted with a couple of singers to sing while they played, and they were the Clooney sisters. And one of the Clooney sisters, the two of them, was Rosemary Clooney. Of course, later sang on her own as her sister retired, and she also became the aunt of George Clooney. So Rosemary Clooney got her start in show business in the bandstand in Poe Park.
Why is it important to preserve Poe's cottage?
If we are to understand who we are as a people, we have to understand what made us what we are. We are the sum total of everything that came before us. And therefore, if we are to understand ourselves, understand the society in which we live, we must preserve at least parts of that heritage that we have. We have that heritage, we add to it, and then we pass it on as a legacy to the next generation. And as long as Poe Cottage exists, we have an idea of how Poe lived, what motivated him to write what he did, and we have an idea of that heritage that has come before us. And that is the reason why Poe Cottage must be preserved.
I think you answered most of my questions that I had. So, like, I want to give you opportunity. Is there anything else about Poe Park, your personal connection or history-wise, that you think that needs to be known?
The only thing is the most recent addition to the park is the Poe Park Visitor Center, and that was designed by a young woman who's Japanese. And if you notice the shape of the roof, it is supposed to remind people of the Raven. Now, Poe did not write the Raven in the Bronx.
Did he finish the Raven here?
No, I don't believe he finished it. It was published before he actually moved here.
Okay.
And but it was like the last thing published before he moved here, and of course it became internationally known. And he did receive a letter while he was living here from England saying that. People were reading the Raven and the hairs stood up on their end as they were reading it because of the, of what the poem was all about. And it seems that he liked that. He liked, in his writings, to scare people half out of their wits. However, when you met him in person, he was very gentle. And he spoke rather low, not very loudly. And so he was in a sense, the exact opposite of what his public image would have been if you just read his literary works.
I actually have one more question.
Sure.
What do you think is Poe's legacy?
What is Poe's legacy?
Edgar Allan Poe's legacy?
Well, his literature does it. First of all, he was first and foremost a literary critic. That's what he was known for basically in his lifetime. He wrote a lot of reviews of literary works, and he was very, very critical. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow would quake in his boots if he found out that Edgar Allan Poe was reviewing one of his poems. Just as a personal thing, there was a very early poet that lived in the Bronx, in the area, named Joseph Rodman Drake. And he wrote rather light verse at the time, but he wrote more serious stuff that was not published in his lifetime. And after he died, his wife published the more serious stuff. And it came out as The Culprit Fay and Other Poems by Joseph Rodman Drake. And that was in 1835, and Edgar Allan Poe reviewed it. Now, I had read it on myself, that book. One of the poems in that book is called Bronx, and it's about the Bronx River. And I looked at it, I looked at the other poems, and I said, I think the Bronx is the best poem of the lot. I said, I'm prejudiced, but then I read Edgar Allan Poe's review, and Edgar Allan Poe says the best poem of the lot is Bronx. I said, well, what do you know? He also has, in the movement towards the Romantic movement in literature, art, and culture, his poetry and his short stories are very early examples of romantic style literature, and it has a great influence in many ways. In the early 20th century, with a lot of immigrants coming into the Bronx from Tsarist Russia, many of them were, almost all of them as a matter of fact, were Jewish people, and among them were people who wrote in Yiddish and literature in Yiddish. They've heard of Edgar Allan Poe, and they came here to Poe Park, to Poe Cottage, because of Edgar Allan Poe, and some of them have actually written in Yiddish poems about Poe and the cottage. So it's like throwing a pebble in a pond. You know, the ripple effect of Edgar Allan Poe is still going on.